Perfect. So a warm welcome to today's Growth Talk about attracting and retaining international talent. My name is Verena and I'm working in the Project Exportoffensive at the Carinthia University of Applied Sciences. And I have the honor to guide you through today's Growth Talk. So I'm very happy to introduce you to our wonderful speaker today, Margareta Sailer. Maggie is the expert on scaling international companies and international recruitment. She was, for example, involved in scaling famous startups like Tesla and BlackBerry. Maggie is also the founder of Monday Squares, a consultancy service for building company cultures, onboarding, or recruitment. And lastly, Maggie is also the author of this wonderful book here, Culture Up: How Startups Succeed by Putting People First. So to cut the long story short, Maggie has a really impressive and inspiring career and definitely a lot of knowledge to share with us today. Before we get started, I just want to add a quick comment about today's procedure. So first, we will get a presentation of Maggie about attracting and retaining international talent. And afterwards, we have time for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please just share them in the chat so that I can later on collect them, summarize them, and ask them to Maggie. So that's from my side. And now I'm very happy to hand over to you, Maggie.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you for everybody to joining us today. Thank you for making the time to see me and listen to us here and allowing me to share my experience. I hope it will be really useful. Before I start to share my slides, obviously Verena has already given a little bit of an introduction to myself. I really found my passion in startups. I have worked, of course, in larger corporate organizations over the years, but I really have found my passion in startups and scale-ups, most importantly. When I started working with the likes of BlackBerry, for example, Tesla, right at the beginning when nobody really knew Elon or Lilium. And this is exactly why I founded Monday Squares, because it allows me to work with founders from a strategic perspective to really think about people, to really think about what makes people thrive, what makes people succeed. So that is really why I decided to set up my own company 2 years ago, as much as writing the book of Culture Up, and obviously my co-author and I, Mareike Mutzberg, do really believe that the future is human-centric. So yeah, so give me just 1 second. I shall share my slides and then we can go right into my background and a little bit of my experience. So Verena, if it's okay, I'm just gonna try and get it up running. So just bear with me for 1 minute. Me and my Mac are friends sometimes, not always, but I think I can make it happen. Okay, let's see. Great.
We can see your slides.
Okay, awesome. Great. I'm just going to move you guys on the top. So if it looks like I'm doing something funny, I'm literally just wanting to see you guys as well. So I'm moving you in my position. Okay, so today's the day where we're talking about attracting and retaining international talent. And with that, I really wanted to start to talk a little bit about some of my personal experience to start off first and foremost. So back in 2010, I worked in one of the very first European head offices of Tesla in Europe. Now, at the time, we were about 30 people in Europe and 300 worldwide. And our offices were located in the UK, really close to Windsor Castle and next to the Victoria Barracks, which is Army Barracks. And from the location, the armed forces set off every day at the exact same time, changing guards. I'm sure you have seen this on TV before, when they changed the guards to go over to the Queen. And I often got to watch and hear them marching across town and playing music, which was awesome. I loved it. So one day, though, I got really intrigued about how the armed forces recruit, because I could see a lot of similarities between what companies or startup needs. So I actually decided to go over and talk to the member of the armed forces about the recruitment practices. And it really made a difference to me by standing there and understanding how they do things. So I started to get to know from the person I talked to that they didn't just look into the qualities of, what a fitness level is of a person, or they didn't just think about, what life skills they have. They really looked most importantly into the mindset. So what sort of mindset did these people have? Are they resilient? Are they adaptive? And most important, can they work in a team? And I remember all of this so vividly, and I wanted to share the story because it changed my life, actually. So there was a particular time when the guards were doing their usual changing ritual, and it was July, and it was super sunny. It was these really wide, beautiful blue skies. And in Windsor, if you've ever been there, they have these beautiful flowers along the way. So when you walk on the old cobblestones through this really sort of ancient looking city, you get all of this aroma, and I loved it. So I walked towards lunch, where I was able to catch up with my manager over food. And like I said before, actually, this particular lunch, this one lunch, really did change my life in a way that I've never expected, to be honest. When I joined Tesla, I was really excited. I was excited about what the company did. I was excited about the fact that they were the underdog. I was excited about the fact that they wanted to make the world different as we know it. And I was excited about expansion, because I am from Europe. I love working with different people. So I was really excited about all of that, but never in my wildest dreams did I expect things to happen how they happen. But anyway, as I casually bit into my sandwich, my boss at the time actually said to me, "Oh, you know what, Maggie, we're going to hire 100 people." And bearing in mind, this was 10 years ago, in the first year of operating at Tesla. She said, "Oh, we're going to expand by 100 people, and we're actually going to expand across Europe." And I was sitting there thinking, did I just hear that right? Who hires like 100 people with an unknown brand? I mean, how is this going to go? But the reality is, this wasn't the last time I've heard that. So over the 6 years that I managed to work at Tesla, we actually recruited over 4,000 employees across the whole of Europe. And obviously my partners in the US, they would be recruiting worldwide. So like I said, trust me, nothing ever stayed the same after I ate this sandwich and bit into it, apart from my wonderful family and partner. They ground me so much. But today I'm here to share examples and practical tips of what I've learned throughout my career. And I really hope that it will enable you to take those along the way and make your life a little easier, because sometimes we just make it far too hard for ourselves. But before I start, I want to get you to think about something in a minute. And it's something that you can write down for yourself. It's not something that I need you to share, by the way, but I really want you to think about something, because it is important to this topic that we're talking about today. So I want to know from you guys, and I'll give you a minute or two to think about this and write it down. What attracted you to join your current company? So if you're currently employed, or if you're currently at university, I suppose the question would be, what attracted you to go to this particular university that you are currently in? Was it the people, the brand, the field of study, the company's reputation, the money, if you're in a working job? What was it? So what attracted you? And I want you to keep that theme throughout as we go on this journey together. And I want you to think about it after as well. And what the most important part is, I want you to connect with the feelings that you had throughout this experience. So if you are working today, think about what sort of thoughts and feelings did you have when you applied for the job or when you were asked to join the company? What sort of thoughts and feelings did you have when you got offered the job, which is typically really exciting? Or, what sort of thoughts and feelings do you have now? Because it makes a difference. So keep that in your minds. I can see people scribbling. I think that's really good. I'm sure you didn't expect to do some work here. That's the last thing I ask you to do. Okay, but it's important. There's a good reason for it. Okay, so we're going to talk about search and selection when you expand the company. From a company perspective, we need to think about international expansion, not just from a business angle, of taking our business operation, products and services abroad. We also need to consider the company's culture. So that's your existing talent and the company's brand, because it really is a key element to lure in the top talent. So when it comes to actually, finding and leading people, this is an interesting one. I've been thinking about this long and hard. When it actually comes to finding and leading people, you will find some good books on this topic, but you won't find them en masse. And rarely, we actually discussed this just before we came online, rarely you will find lectures at universities or schools that are dedicated to finding and leading people. But when you join the business world, let's face it, these skills are essential to success. Because the people you surround yourself with are the sum total, basically, of the people you surround yourself with. So who you hire, who you spend time with, makes a difference. And it doesn't just make a difference to a scaling company. It also makes a difference if you work in a large corporation. It doesn't matter if you expand a scaling company or if you expand a large corporation. The people that you hire are actually, that's one of your most important jobs as a manager or anyone involved in the business. So I'm not entirely sure if some of you have heard about this or know about this much, but hiring the wrong person can cost you. And actually, approximately 30% of the employee's first earnings. So that is what it will physically cost you when you hire the wrong person. But it's not just that, because think about the time that you spend as a leader potentially, the time your team spends in an interview process, but also the time it takes for the person to get trained and to get up and running. So that really adds up. But hiring and selecting the right person will and should take up to good 80% of your working time if you're part of an expanding company. And I'm sure that people don't want to hear that or haven't heard that before. But the reality is that when you work in an expanding company, you should really be hiring 80% of your time to find the top talent, either locally or to bring them in from overseas, or to, expand your company and hire them in a new country that you're going into. And it's really everyone's job, to look out for people that are part of the company's employer brand, right? So think about your people and think about everyone around you to be that employer brand, because that is something I will talk about in a minute. And one thing that I have to say that I have learned throughout my years of hiring is that when everyone gets involved in recruiting, the really successfully fast scaling companies, they do involve everyone within the company or as many people as possible. So they really build a recruiting machine. So that's something you want to think about when you expand. It doesn't matter how fast or slow, that is actually irrelevant. The most important thing to be successful is to build a recruiting machine. And now we're coming to the tips part when it comes to hiring international. And some of the things here, if some of you have read my book, or you might have had the chance to read it or you read parts of it. Some of the things I'm telling you here aren't necessarily new, but I've certainly thrown in some new statistics and bits and pieces and personal stories for today. So one of my really top tip when it comes to scaling a company internationally is to have a plan. And when you work in startups, not so much with large companies, but large companies can have that too. But when you work with startups, that's not a word you want to use when you sort of start off. So having a plan, planning ahead, it's something that they don't want to hear. But the reality is you need a recruiting strategy and you need to have a plan. maybe just sharing a story here. So when I was asked to join Lilium in Munich, you know, the electric jet company that's going to take off and fly, and our future will look like the Jetsons and the Fifth Element in 5 to 10 years. I can't wait. When I was actually asked to join this company back in 2017, I actually implemented a headcount plan within 1 year. And I did that together with the finance team, the chief commercial officer, and the CEO. And to be really honest with you, it made all the difference to us. And it was a vital part of our success, I would say today, because we really sat down and took time to think about, as a group of, as a whole company, you know, who do we need to hire? To what type of position? When? In which countries are we going to expand into, or where do we want to have people from? You know, what companies are they supposed to come from? Who are our competitors? So you want to approach recruiting actually as a really strategic topic rather than a band-aid, which is something that companies sometimes do. It's like, I have too much work, I'm hiring somebody, here's a band-aid. So it is definitely always to be advised to be on the forward-thinking strategic role. And there's something we did on top of that. We actually talked about critical and vital roles within the business. And we did that very regularly. So we sat together and thought about, if we don't hire position X, where does it leave us? Where does that leave our funding? Where does that leave our prototype? So it's really important to have the constant conversation as a senior leadership group of what is vital to the success of the business. And on the back of that, we actually formed advertising strategies for each of these critical roles, because if you hire 100 people or 400 people, not everybody's always critical, right? It goes in phases, it goes in quarters. So that is definitely something I want to share with you guys, because it made a real difference. Having those priority roles, you know, having these ideas of where to search, where to advertise, who to tap into, you know, which business networks to go to. It changes the way you approach, you know, people and how you expand. And I honestly have to say that the power of a team is incredible. So we actually made sure that everyone in the business understood our hiring priorities, so that everybody could come together and give us a referral. Because if you hire great people, the reality is quite often they're no good other people, don't they? Because to be fair with you, and I'm going to be very honest here, I mean, otherwise it would have been really hard to scale from 30 to 400 people in 2.5 years. So I and my recruiting team at the time and the whole HR team, we couldn't have done it without the business. So it's really advised to get everybody involved. And within 3 years, Lilium was valued over 1 billion. So within 3 years, after I started, Lilium was classified as a unicorn. So that was so exciting for me, because that was something I always wanted when I started working for Lilium. I had conversations with the founders even before I joined about what their ambitions were. And, you know, we got there within 3 years. And in 2021, the company went public through NASDAQ. So it's incredible. I just love the Lilium story and you know, how everything progresses in this new era of how we're going to travel in the future. So having a plan and communicating it is something that benefits not just your investors, but it benefits also your employees, because it fosters commitment, right? Because if somebody understands the strategy and they can see their personal growth and their involvement in it, you really got them. You know, you really have them excited. You really get them involved in everything else. So another part of searching for the right candidate or finding the right candidate as you're expanding internationally is definitely employer branding. So don't underestimate the power of a brand, any brand, good or bad. We all know it. We have the good stories about a brand. We have the bad stories of a brand. But also don't underestimate the power of your personal brand when you are in business. So myself, you guys sitting here, the ones who are already in your workplace, we all, if we like it or not, we actually have a brand ourselves. We just don't call it that, but that is the reality. So think about this, bear with me for a minute, right? So if you are a company that is early in its operation, what do? So your brand is unknown, people don't know you, but what can you do? There's always something how you can help yourself. So my tip is to actually use your founders and your leadership team and your investors to speak at specific events, make strategic connections, maybe with, politicians, or it could be with leaders in that particular space that you're operating in, and set up press conferences, because you really need to make a noise. If you're an unknown company and you're expanding, you really need to make a noise, and you can use your own website. It doesn't need to always be so expensive. You can use social media to not just talk about your product, because that's something we all do, but most importantly, to talk about what it's like to work here. So really talk about, really sort of, go the extra mile, I suppose, and use your website and social media to create a personal connection with the other person on the other side. So the other person on the other side of the computer needs to understand what challenges can they solve if they join you? What's going to be exciting if I join the next company? And if you are sitting at university and you're thinking about your next job, you will be very curious to probably think, does this company align with my values potentially? Does it align with my culture? Does it align with my field of study? What is it? Going back to my original questions. So really get people excited about what you do, and show them what they can learn and how they can progress and better themselves while they're with you. So employer branding makes a massive, massive difference. Actually, I want to give an example from my early Tesla days, because I think it's really topical because of who I'm talking to today and the location that we're in. Because back in my early Tesla days, we had to recruit English-speaking service managers and car mechanics in Vienna, right, where I'm from. So I'm originally from Vienna, born there, raised there, lived there, and I've been for the last 18 years in the UK. In 2010, however, the world was really quite different. And it was a challenge, as you can imagine, right? Because Tesla was an unknown brand. So it was the new kid on the block, wanting to produce electric cars. And over 10 years ago, that was considered crazy, right? I mean, think about this for a minute. I have had conversation 10 years ago with people about what I'm doing and how we're building Tesla, and they literally thought I was crazy. But everyone we recruited at Tesla obviously wasn't, and we recruited them very specifically based on the fact that they were believers. But coming from Vienna, and understanding the German-speaking region and the culture allowed me to act on what I knew. So one part of my family comes from Lower Austria, and we have a saying, or we had a saying back there. I don't think that's used so often anymore. My family, one part of my family is from Waldviertel, and the saying is, was der Bauer nicht kennt, ist nicht. So I made this sentence really nicely now. But the meaning kind of translates into, if you don't understand something, you don't want it, or you don't want to get involved with it, right? And this is, and I have to say it because I've lived abroad and I traveled a lot, this is a very Germanic way of thinking, and we're changing, and we're doing things a lot differently. But I knew back then I had to build a brand for Tesla. So I knew I wasn't just recruiting and expanding, I had to help the company build a brand, so we could gain that reputation and trust. So back in the days, I decided to advertise in a newspaper called The Standard. I'm sure that some of you guys know The Standard. And that also means that advertising these types of jobs are actually a really unusual thing to do, because actually that's not what The Standard is all about, right? But for us, it was more than just advertising a job. It was building a brand. It was reaching out to a vast array of people. So not just advertising on Monster and, all these local job boards in Austria that we had, but it was also to go to the newspapers, and it worked. It was great actually, because after the advertising in that magazine, our website hits increased. We received more applications, and we received more applications not just because people had actually read the newspaper, but quite often actually when they applied and we asked them, they actually told us that some of their friends have read the newspaper and they thought of them, and they got so excited that they picked up the phone and told them to apply because they thought this was, the once in a lifetime chance. So, going out of your way to create an employer brand, either locally when you expand or when you're expanding international, really makes a difference. But I suppose some of you guys here on the call, you might be working for a big company and brand that is still continue to expand into new countries, right? And you still can't get around the employer branding, because you still want to search for the best people out there, don't you? You want to have the best people in your team, especially when you expand and set up a new office abroad. You want the best people so the company has the best chance. So go and understand your local advertising channels, and get out there to ensure that people you're hiring, whatever that means locally, like we said, through events, through connections, through the press, social media is a big thing, universities. Sometimes it's really important to target the right universities and get that message out. And also working with recruitment agencies. I think sometimes there is a belief that recruitment agencies are all bad, but actually that's not the case. Actually, quite often a recruitment agency understands the talent landscape and the labor market a lot better than you. So it really does make sense that when you expand internationally, that you form those really good relationships with some recruitment agencies that will help you to expand quicker, because people will trust that agency like they have done whenever I worked with Lilium or Tesla. It works for me every single time. I'm not kidding. But yeah, I think one of the other things is to, when you expand internationally, one other tip is, of course, most importantly, to hire people in the country who really understand your industry or have worked in that industry, because they have vital connections, and that will make them successful in their role straight away. And going back to the employer branding has two sides. So employer branding is one thing, as we talked about as a company, but there's also your brand. So there's also you as an individual, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a big brand name behind you or not. I think one of the really important things is in the recruitment process, you need to make sure that everyone is fully aligned on the job and the type of person that you hire from day one. From experience and talking to a lot of candidates and having worked in different companies myself, I have learned that isn't always a given. It doesn't matter how big or small a company is. Not every company has a good, solid recruitment process, and not all interviews experiences are good. So when you have time later, maybe think a little bit about interviews that you went to and that you enjoyed, and those who you didn't. But it's always good to keep things fresh on top of your mind when you expand. One thing that I would say is also really important on that brand for yourself, but also the employer brand as a company, the interview panel really needs to be able to rhyme off the company's values and goals and missions in their sleep. So if I go, wake up, do an interview and tell me what you're all about, I would expect the interview panel to really know that to excite me, to really understand, on the other hand, what it is to be a candidate, and not forget about the days when they were a candidate. But they also need to 100% understand what a successful hire looks like in the background. Otherwise, you cannot make a decision in the end. And what you want to achieve with a good recruitment process, and what you particularly want to achieve if you expand, is that you can make faster decisions, which is why you need to create a recruiting machine. So here's the thing with employer branding. some of you may or may not know, 75% of candidates will research a company before they apply to a job, and they will cast a judgment on what they see. And of course, what they hear and experience during the recruitment process makes up for the final decisions, because it would make it up for you as well if you think about this for a minute. So the company brand, the employer brand, and your brand as a person is all interconnected at any time. That is something that I've learned in my career that's really important to put on top of people's minds, because with everything that's going on in our world, at work and outside, I think it's really easy to forget that, but it does make all the difference. So if I go back to the hiring process, and I know process is a word that not everybody likes, but there needs to be a plan to all the madness. So if you don't have a process, spend time to carve out a hiring process that scales. So get your teams, your existing teams within the company involved as much as you can in finding that really best talent, and train them regularly to keep the recruiting standards high, because that's what you always want in business, right? You want to get some really good talent in to help you expand. If you think of the likes of Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, they all spend time to continuously work on the hiring processes. And often you will find that they consist of, interviews, talking to each other. They will also quite often have actual skills and cultural assessment fit. So they will assess the cultural fit by asking very specific questions based on the company culture. And quite often there's a technical test, a game, or presentations. So what I'm trying to say is recruitment isn't rocket science. It really is not rocket science, but my actual tip is that a solid structure and an overall plan makes a real difference to your hiring speed. It makes a difference to your candidate journey and to your employer brand. And that is what you need when you expand, regardless if it's locally or regardless if it's internationally. So go back to your expansion plan, to really understand those critical hires. Make sure you and the company understands the bigger picture and the higher goals and the role you play within it. And set up a process that works, within the company. Because one thing that I've noticed throughout all my career in being in other roles, because I haven't always been in HR, I've also worked in marketing and other things. But one thing that I always notice is that people love to get involved. And quite often, if they can, they really want to have a say what type of colleagues they're going to work with in the future, if you give them the opportunity. And I promise you, 99% of your time, you will make a quicker hiring decision, right? I think there will always be the odd role, even if you have set up a really good interview panel, that people can't agree on a final candidate. But even if that is the case, then you go back to scratch and you reassess and you make a quicker decision and you start over again. So yeah, get that plan, incorporate it into your employer branding, set your hiring process up and get your people involved. And as we're running out of time, as I've noticed, I'm just going through my final slide now, and then we open for Q&A and any questions, because one of the really important parts of finding that great international talent, which is so hard to come by these days, is actually to retain it. And here's some interesting stuff. So I'm going to share some stats in a minute. But one thing when it comes out to retaining your current and newly added people, it is key to always look out for your people and create that solid foundation that everyone can thrive in and grow. So what I actually did on retention is I picked out my favorite topics and what I deem as most important elements for retention, because there are many, but I'll just start to talk you through 3 different topics here. And one of the big ones is leadership. Because actually the type of manager and the type of people you're involved with make a difference to everyone at work and how you make a decision of how we're going to join a company. So create a standard of what good leadership looks like. That's one of the tips that I've always give, and we have done in the past, and it worked really well. So we created a standard of what good leadership look like. We communicated it to our leaders, and we trained people. And most importantly, you hold them accountable, because there's nothing worse than talking about good leadership and then people go off and do silly things and they're not being held accountable for it. Can't be worse for an existing employee than having to witness and see that. So leadership teams really need to be a tight unit. The communication needs to be aligned and precise. So investing in your leadership training will affect your bottom line. And like, you know, I hinted on it before a little bit. I mean, who really wants to work with a manager who never responds to you? Who wants to work with somebody who doesn't share information and keep their teams in the dark? Who wants to work for a company where one manager allows you to spend money and employee education and the next manager in the next department doesn't? I don't know many people that would find that great as an employee. And for those who are currently at university and joining the workforce, think about the type of leader you would like to work with, because there are many out there, I can tell you. So keep your leadership teams trained, supported, and aligned, because it's vital for their own mental health and work performance, but it also affects the overall teams. And another part of leadership within the company is looking out for your teams in the sense that you offer a great environment to work in. And what I mean by that is it's not just HR's role, predominantly it is, but it's not just that, but it's really important to keep a close eye on workforce trends, because when you go all the way to expand a company, you need to keep these people. And how do you do that? By giving them what they want. So I actually looked at various studies, and there are very clear trends for 2023. And it shows that compensation, work-life balance, personal development, and the demand for flexible working and remote working in 2023 is still here to stay. And the other trend that continues is the automation of tools. So I'm not just talking HR tools to make it easy for your employees to interact with you and get help if they need it, but I'm talking about everything in the company. So automating tools so that, you know, the daily grind is something that can be automated and teams actually have more time to spend on solving problems, come up with new ideas and build vital relationship inside and outside of company. So that's a key part to retention. And from a personal leadership perspective, know what you're good at. So as a manager, don't hire an extension of you. Really find people that add to your existing teams and skills. Think about sports. It's a strategic effort to build a good team of players. So it doesn't mean if that's football or ice hockey or polo, you name it. But it really does make a difference of who you select as your striker and your goalkeeper, because not everyone should be able to do everything. So as a leader, really think about the people that add to your team. And the third part really I wanted to talk about, and I'm really looking at the time here, is diversity, equity, inclusion, because that is something that is so important. And it is something that needs to be built into the very core of your company. So going back to a McKinsey study that was done late 2022, the data actually suggested that a diverse team are 87% better in making decisions. So if you have that as a core, and the most cultural and ethically diverse companies outperform the less diverse ones by as much as 36%. Now, that makes a difference if you're going to be successful in your company expansion or not. It doesn't matter if it's local. It doesn't matter if it's internationally. You still need to understand your local customs and culture, but you need to create equality among the company across the globe. So think about this from an employee's experience for a second. So that should be the same in each country. So how somebody obtains a holiday and reports a grievance should not differ across countries. But most importantly, how these matters are being dealt with, how your leadership teams respond, are even more important to make sure that there is an equality amongst all of your employees and nobody feels treated unfairly. And it's also very clear from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective that more and more studies show that people want to see themselves represented at work. You want to see yourself represented in politics, in media, in arts, in education. It doesn't matter. So if your product or service is aimed at a diverse customer base, this diversity should be reflected in your team, and it will help you to attract and retain the best minds out there. Enabling learning and growth is pretty much the last thing I will give to you now, and then I will leave you with that, and then I'm happy to answer any of your questions. But when it comes to retention, actually enabling learning and growth is ever so important. And the reason why that is, and why companies should foster that, is that we're grappling with a skill shortage, and it's estimated that over half of the global workforce will need to be retrained in the next 5 years, because of the fact of how we're going to change at work, how we do business daily. And if you actually look at McKinsey reports, they already say that 43% of leaders report that they already have a skills gap and they can't find the right people. And I know it because I have been dealing with this for quite a while now. So how you retain your staff and enable them to learn and grow is ever so important. In the past, when I worked for companies, so I'm sharing a bit of a learning here. When I worked for companies previously, we were very much focused on enabling people to continue to foster their technical skills, their language abilities, compliance are really important, and really get them to learn it initially, which is still really relevant. But for 2023 and beyond, we really need to enable our international workforce to thrive in a time of adversity where resilience and creativity is needed. And so what I mean by that is, when you look at retention and when you look at training, one thing that you really need to push on top now is training people on soft skills. So that's training people on what we call power, train them for the power skills. So that is, for example, how do we deal with adversity? So teach people resilience, teach them how to work in a team, how to foster design thinking and creativity, because that will get you further. So anything that worked in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s will not work for future generations across the globe in the workplace. So to bring this to a close, because I'm wildly over time, remember to have a plan, build a brand, establish that recruitment process, and invest in diversity and inclusion and leadership and training. So thank you very much for having me and listening to me.
So thank you very much, Maggie, for this great presentation. I have to say, I really got a lot of new perspectives on the topic of recruitment, and I'm sure the audience as well. So please, if there are any questions, just use the chat to ask them. And there is actually already the first question of one of our intercultural management students here, Foram. She asks, what are some very important traits that you look for in a candidate while hiring?
Yeah, super good question, actually. So from the experience of the companies I worked for, and bearing in mind predominantly they're startups, and they're very much technology driven, I would say every company these days, though, looks for people who can solve a problem. That is very important in life these days. So when we enter the workforce, none of us know straight away what we're doing, right? But the most important part of being able to deal with it is knowing how to solve a problem and how to help yourself. So that would be one thing that I would always say, and even ask, in a candidate. And I would ask, is in a big company? And because also big companies, they need to stay on top of technology. They can't rest on their laurels. They need to keep going. So how to solve problems, how to help yourself is really important. And for the companies that I've worked in, team player, tell us how you work in a team, or give us, examples when you led a team, or whatever it would be, your project. So teamwork is a really, really big one, because actually you don't just want a company full of great people, like these eccentric minds that come up with all of these ideas. If they can't work in a team, it's a struggle. So yeah, so that would be my answer to that.
Perfect, thank you. May I just ask you to stop sharing your screen, because then we see you bigger again?
Yes, okay, of course.
Perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, let me stop it here.
Question
Awesome.
I have to check. So another question is, like, in your opinion, what is the role of onboarding in retaining and integrating specifically international employees?
Mm-hmm. I think onboarding in general is actually one of the most important things a company will do or has to do. Because if you think about the length and the time and the money it takes to recruit people, and the reality is that it can take, for some positions, 3 months to hire a person, from start to finish. It can take 6 months, and with some really critical and difficult roles, it can even take 12 months. So actually, onboarding is one of the most important things you do. And unfortunately, one of the most overlooked things in a lot of companies. So it's vital, actually. And onboarding doesn't mean spending a week with your team. Ideal onboarding goes over 2 or 3 months. And ideal onboarding means that you find buddies within a company. So you find a buddy in your own department when you're new hire, but ideally you also get connected to another buddy in a completely different department, because you want to make sure that people understand already who to go to and what to do. So one part is to really understand today, how do I do my job? Where do I find the process and the documents? So you have your buddy in your team. But then also you want to understand the bigger picture. And with onboarding, it's really important that people have the ability and are allowed to understand what's the plan for the company, where are we going, what are we doing, who are our investors. At Lilium, for example, we put together an onboarding that I absolutely loved. We made sure that, one of our founders and our CEOs, they actually got to speak to our new hires. So every month we had an employee onboarding day or 2 days, depending on how much people we took in. And they really got the chance over a period of time, 3 months, to meet different founders, meet different head of departments. Somebody would tell them how to do finance. I would tell people about the referral process and how we hire. So yeah, it's super important. It's definitely not valued enough, but it will make that massive difference, because especially when you go abroad, when you start out, you want to make sure that your culture also takes it, your culture, your company culture goes with you. So yeah, onboarding is important.
Great,
hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Another interesting question in my eyes is, will the recruitment process be taken over by artificial intelligence in the future? What do you think?
Yeah, you know what? It's a super interesting question, that, and it's a really hard one to answer, because I've been rattling my brain about this for the last 5+ years. And I'm not entirely sure if it will be totally replaced by it, because people like to speak to people, because that's how we trust, that's how we build trust, that's how we build a relationship. But I can totally see the value, and I've already seen it, in automating certain parts of the processes. So very much so, you can help your recruiting team to actually spend more time on the phone to candidates and make sure that you find the right candidates in the first place. So there is already a lot of automation actually in recruiting and HR. I think it will really depend on the company if they will ever be fully replaced by artificial intelligence. Some companies, it will suit that. Some roles maybe, but I would say that this personal connection is always an important one. In graduate recruitment, I see it more and more, by the way. So when graduates get selected and recruited, I've seen that artificial intelligence is used through gamification, assessing people's skills and abilities. So it's a tricky one to answer, to be fair. I think a balance is always good.
Perfect, thank you. And as we have a lot of students in the call, I think the next question might be of interest to a lot of people. So one person asked, what would you suggest to students who are having their first job interviews?
Yeah, good question. Prepare. Value the time of the person that sits on the other side. So it doesn't mean if that's over a telephone interview, it doesn't mean if that's a face-to-face interview. Think about what the other person, who they are in the business, and what sort of questions you want to answer, because I'm going to tell you the reality here of finding a job, especially when you come out of university. The reality often is that when you have an open job, anything from 300 to 500 people can apply. So first and foremost, you need to make your resume stand out. You want to make it easy for people to look at your resume. So what sort of projects have you worked on at university? Have you worked next to university? What did you do? Have you done any sort of projects outside of university? So give already information first and foremost to get to that interview stage. And when you make it to that interview stage, research the company and write down your questions, because it's so important to ask questions, not just for yourself, because you want to know, and you should really know what you're getting yourself into if you can. But also it's good for the person to see that you've prepared yourself, because for that person, you will be a half-an-hour call. So how you behave on a half-an-hour call makes all the difference. So show you're interested, show you that you've done research, ask some clever questions, and that should help you, hopefully.
Perfect, thank you. We have actually a related question. Do you have any advice for developing a personal brand, especially for students about to search for their first jobs?
Yeah, it's a good one. So personal brand can be internal as well. So it doesn't, I'm not necessarily talking about social media or things like that. So you actually, before you would say, and Ruf, what's that in English? Like your reputation, right? So you develop a reputation. And so even at university, you might already develop a reputation for being super helpful in the project, or you might develop a reputation for leading a complex project, or I don't know what it might be, right? And use that as your leverage to talk about it, because you don't just need to show that on social media. Social media isn't for everyone. I don't think everyone should get involved in that. It's not necessary, but it's just about having those examples to talk about, you know, who you are, and then also tell them that there are references that can reference for you and can explain what it's like to work with you. So a personal reference, or again, if you've had your first job, you know, did this person really listen? Did they really want to work? You know, did they really go the extra mile? Were they super friendly with customers? So you can do that offline. You don't have to do personal, you don't have to necessarily do that as a brand online. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And as we're talking about international recruitment today, one student asked, in your opinion, how much of an impact do bias and stereotypes have when hiring international candidates?
Bias is a tricky one, because we all have biases, including me. And I luckily pay so much attention. I can tell when I have one as well, which is very funny, but it's good that I can tell, right? So I need to reflect a lot, but I can tell, I know that I have biases, so work on them really hard. Bias is always there. So actually in a company, it's really important to train people on unconscious bias, but not just train them and make them aware of it, but also help them understand how they can actively work on it. So that's a really important part, because again, ideally you want to, if you can, create an open workplace. You want to invite different opinions from different countries, people from all walks of life, because that will really help you to create this incredible product that everyone will want to use. So sort of look at your Apple, you know, look at your Teslas, look at some of the cool stuff you see, you know, quite often that's created by a really global workforce. So with biases, they will always be there. It always depends on how conscious you are about them. So get yourself some training and sit and reflect on what biases you have. And you get biases from childhood, you get biases from who you spend your time with, what you watch, what you listen to, if you travel or not. So just take a bit of time and reflect about it.
Perfect. Another question is, what kind of digital tools do you use during the hiring experience?
So I'm guessing that's from both sides. So digital tools, actually everything is digital these days if you think about it, because your applicant tracking system. So when you apply to a website, there's already an applicant tracking system sitting at the back, because the companies need to be GDPR compliant. You know, it's about personal data and managing that. So you already have your digital tools there. We all use social media these days when it comes to recruiting, from your TikTok to your Facebook and your LinkedIn and other things, depending on where you hire and who you want to hire. I see it a lot in gamification. You know, I've seen a lot of games for people to play rather than doing a technical test. Some of the tools that we have put in place, for example, at Tesla, were online technical tests. So actually where you could interact on whiteboards, because we hired some really clever, cool people, that were into physics and all sorts of stuff, and they had to interact with each other. So, but there's so much these days, on how you send a reply, how you do your reports. There's loads actually.
There is just another question related to this topic. And one person asked, how important is social media regarding in the new recruiting process?
Yeah, I'd say it's massively important, because if you look at the generations now and the generations to come, they are used to social media. I mean, I constantly need to talk to my niece and my nephew back home in Vienna and their friends to understand where they hang out these days, because my generation typically hangs out on Facebook. So it is really important. Going back to having a plan and making a plan in recruiting, it does make a difference, because if I want to reach a certain audience at a different stage of their career, I need to understand where they are. So to a lot of the generations, it makes a difference using social media, because from an employer branding perspective, you want to show the world what it's like to work in your company. You want to show the world real people that work in your company, to see what they do on a day-to-day basis. I think especially when you come out of school, or you do an apprenticeship, or you come out of university, it's not always so simple to think about what job you should get into or what it look and feel like, unless you use employer branding through YouTube, social media, videos. So it's essential. Really, it really is essential.
Another question is what kind of questions would you suggest it would be beneficial to ask in a job interview? Again, from the perspective from a student.
From a student, yeah. So it really does depend on what you're interested in, but I think generally it's always a good question to ask, what's it like to work for the company, or why has the person that you're speaking to, why did they join the company? What do they like about the company? What does the future hold in the company? So what sort of growth is there, or how does it look like? Career paths, because especially if you're at the beginning of your career, it's good to be curious. It's always good to be curious, let's face it. But at the beginning of your career, because you can't talk so much about what you've done in the last 5 years at work, you will have more engagement, and you are more expected to be curious about doing a good job. So you can ask these things. Of course, salary and benefits, they're all good things to know, but I would ask that at the end, or maybe in your second interview even, depends on, how much you want to know that. But really get to know the company. What are their goals? What are they going to do this year? What have they done really well last year? Does the company allow you to get into social things like charities? I don't know. What are you interested in? But these would be some core questions I definitely ask. And obviously, what is the job all about? How big is the team? What are they looking for in the candidate that to be successful, in the company? These type of questions, I think I'd ask.
Perfect, thank you. I was just looking at the time, and we're approaching the end. Is it fine for you if I ask you 2 last questions?
Of course. For the fact that I've gone 10 minutes over widely, please do ask.
So the first one is, what advice would you give an applicant to ask for a higher salary when applying for or confirming a job?
So it depends really on where you are in your career, because when do you know that you should get a higher salary? That's a really tricky question, right? Negotiating salaries is important, because the reality is that when you enter a company, the likelihood is you're going to stay on that salary for at least a year. And then it depends on the companies how much emphasis they put on retention. Some companies might give you a pay increase in a year, or when you change a job. So actually negotiating your salary when you enter is important. But you should really do your research to understand the market a bit. So actually, especially when you enter from university, look at the jobs you want to go into and look at what sort of salaries they are advertised at. So you don't have some sort of wild, crazy expectation that no company can match. And it's not just about the salary, I think personally, and that's one thing that I have learned, because sometimes the opportunity is bigger. If I would have just asked for money at Tesla, I would have never had the career that I have today. I would have never learned the things. I would have never have the network I have today if it wasn't for accepting my job at Tesla. And at the beginning, 10 years ago, the salaries weren't high, but we got equity in the company. So be mindful when you think about salaries. I think it's good to say that you're looking for a salary that is fair, that is fairly compensated for the experience and the education that you have. But would I go in and say I wouldn't work for anything below 30,000 if I've never worked? Probably not. And if you are in work and you have 5 years of experience or more, you already have something to stand on. You know, you can talk about what you currently earn and what your package is and what you're expecting. But make it's a dance. It's not a if I get that or question. It's more like how can we work this out together to get a fair compensation package. And like I said, look at the bigger pictures, not just the salary. I know it's important. I get it, especially in the world we live in today, because everything seems so uncertain, but never underestimate the power of a good chance, because it will really bring your career to heights that you might never have been able to get otherwise.
Perfect. As you've talked about the importance of leadership and leadership trainings, I think we have a wonderful last question. It's what was the most effective leadership training that you have come across so far, and what made it so effective?
Good question. There are different ones. I actually think the most effective, so for me personally, right? So this is for me personally now for a minute. Leadership training is always good if you're in a group of people and they're fully aligned, and you go into a leadership training where the company already has a goal. So the goal could be, for example, to get this group of leaders to work better together, you know, to build bridges. So you need to really have a plan. And then you work for 3 days on an offsite event. I always find that offsite events are way better than being distracted in your workplace, and work with them. But one thing that I found most effective actually in any leadership training is coaching and mentoring, funnily enough. And I'm not always talking about the paid kind, because you can find a mentor everywhere. You can find a mentor in your family or through your friends. You can find mentors, especially in Austria. You know, they have so many great opportunities now to get mentors, you know, business mentors. So the female factor does that, the female founders do it. And they also do it for so it doesn't matter if you're male or female or anything like that. So leadership training is one thing, but actually continuously training and honing in your leadership skills are most important. So that's not done with the training for 1 day or 3 days. That is something that you always work on, ideally. I'm not saying everybody does that, but that is very effective to get yourself somebody that you can learn from. And also one thing actually is written in my book that Mareike and I wrote. There's a tip that you can even do yourself at home, and it doesn't cost you anything. It really helped me in my career, because I've built big teams, 2 big teams over time, and I had very international teams. And one way that helped me to be a better leader was to sit down and think, okay, what did I like about my previous leaders that I've seen so far, and what did I not like, and what can I kind of accept and understand that that you need to do in business. And then I looked at role models. So I like Michelle Obama, for example. I like how she talks. She is super intelligent, super smart. So, you know, I looked at these people and thought, okay, what do I like about them? And what can I build into myself? You know, obviously be yourself, but it's good to see things and then think about how you can better yourself. So that is something you can do all the time, every 3, 6, 12 months, to review how you want to come across in daily life and in business. And also think about your values. What are my values? You know, what do I stand for? What do I absolutely not want to stand for? So you can also do that, so you don't have to pay for it. But most effective leadership training, to cut this short, which I'm really not good at today, is to have a training, ideally in person, that works really well, but then keep working on your leadership skills. It never stops, you know, it really never does.
So yeah, unfortunately, we reached the end of our growth talk. So I really want to say a big thank you to you, Maggie, for your time and for sharing your great expertise. I'm sure we could all learn a lot during the past hour. And as this is also the last Growth Talk in our series, I want to take the opportunity to thank our partners, the Corinthian Economic Chamber and also the State of Carinthia. And of course, also a big thank you to everyone who joined us today or some of our previous Growth Talks. I hope you could take some lessons learned with you. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, you can contact one of my colleagues or me, of course. So thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Take good care.